Greetings and welcome to Trinity Radio. I'm Johnathan Pritchett, and today I have Dr. Jim Chatham, Dean of the School of Christ-Centered Counseling at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary. How you doing, Dr. Chatham?
I'm doing quite well. Thank you for asking, and I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
I am too. This is an important topic. Today we're going to be discussing anxiety and depression in light of, well, quite a year that 2020 has been for everybody, with unemployment, with the COVID-19 lockdowns, with civil unrest in major cities. Lots of people out there. Anxiety is on the rise. Depression is on the rise. People are disconnected from their family and their friends. Everyone's walking around in masks. And you teach a course here at Trinity on depression and anxiety, but
Yes.
For a lot of people, and you're also a professional licensed counselor as well, but of course, a lot of people can't get to their therapists or their counselors because of the COVID-19. A lot of people are out of work and can't afford sessions. So as just in general, I wanted to talk to you today about some biblical principles that people can do to cope with, let's say, their anxiety. So I used to have panic attacks myself. And then I got on medication for a while. I haven't been on it in a while since I got in better health, but
Yes.
mine was kind of tied to that. But for other people, triggers for anxiety may be financial, or they may be other things. So if you could, what are some basic principles that people can do to cope with, given everything that's going on right now?
Well, I think one, for all of our listeners to understand today, that what I'm saying is general. There may be some specifics that people could have some things that they really need to sit down with someone and talk about it. They really need to. And so what I'm going to do is kind of general. And again, I admit up front that I will not be able to cover every nuance associated with each listener's depression and anxiety. But I do want to focus, and as you and I discussed in preparation, to make it as practical as we can. Accessibility to counseling in this current culture is very intriguing. As you mentioned, I still see a few people maintain my license as a professional counselor. And a lot of what we're doing right now, we're doing FaceTime. And that means that I schedule appointments. And I don't do many a week, maybe 4 or 5, something like that. But I have to maintain the other. And so I'm doing a lot of them by FaceTime. If someone comes to my office, they have to sign release forms. They're not allowed to sit in waiting rooms and things like that. And that varies, by the way, from state to state. There is no national ethics law per se. So in each state, whether you're in pastoral counseling or some blended form of counseling, or you're nouthetic, or you're, totally secular, whatever, you need to be familiar with the state laws. That being said, during this time, it's very important that people understand some of the triggers associated both with anxiety and depression. So let me just list a few of those, and then, depending on the trigger, then that allows someone to have some understanding as to how they might develop better skills, not only for their own lives, but to help others as well. So, there's some research today that indicates that some anxiety is driven by genetic components. If you want to know that, all you have to do is sit down and, kind of write out like a family tree. It's called a genogram. You write down your mother, your father, your siblings, and then go up to your grandparents and your uncles and aunts and go up. And if you start noticing, well, Dad was really anxious and Grandmom was notorious, we understand maybe there's a little DNA component here, a genetic component. If that's the case, then what we have to do is be aware, and we have to be proactive. And with that, there's a part of your brain and mind called the fight or flight mechanism. God put it there. It has a very good purpose. If your house is on fire, the brain activates and tells your body to secrete adrenaline, and you do supernatural things. If a bear is coming, you might need that. But the problem is, in today's culture, if someone has a tendency, now notice I said it's not determined, it is a tendency. So what that means is I might in my life have a tendency toward anxiety. There's just some way, and there's no test you can really go do that indicates, well, you've got 28% of your anxiety is driven by your DNA component. You can't do that. But even if a believer has a tendency toward anxiety, you can be proactive and say, okay, I have a tendency, so that means I need to do some things. And I need to recognize that too often the fight or flight mechanism in my brain is too active. And so what you can do with that, there's some basic things that a person can do. And I'm going to mention 2 or 3 triggers and then let you zero in on some others. If that's the case, then breathing exercises can be very helpful. I'm not into Middle Eastern mysticism, and what I'm sharing today is not that. But, just to slow down the brain, one of the best ways you can do that is breathe in through your nose, count to 4, just breathe in into your abdominal area. That's important. If you breathe up high, you have a tendency to gasp, and that can cause the brain to be more active. And so what you would do there is just breathe in through your nose, counting 4, hold it in your abdominal area, counting 4, exhale through your nose, counting 4, and do nothing, counting 4. And what that does, the counting stops the brain activity, to a large degree. Then all of a sudden your emotions are slowing down because the brain is slowing down. So you have more space to process. Now, what I like to do to add to that is to breathe in and imagine I'm connecting more with the Lord. He's there, and I'm slowing it down. If we have a lot of false voices yelling at us, such as, well, you're hopeless. There's no way you can do this. You don't have the skill sets. Your mom was driven by anxiety. It's pretty hopeless. You're going to be flooded by that. And that's what happens to a lot of people. They get flooded and false narratives take over. If I can slow down that fight or flight mechanism in my brain, slow down my cognitive processing, then that allows me to stop and connect to truth. And the truth can be, if I'm anxious, the Bible says, don't be anxious for anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication, let your request be made known to God. Most people have read that in Philippians 4. So I slow it down, and rather than listening to the false narratives, then I can simply say, you know what, God has it covered. I may not understand it, but He perfectly loves me. He never departs from me. He never forsakes me. He does not abandon me. And I can trust Him now to work it together for ultimate good.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because when I find myself struggling with my own panic attacks, you're always self-focused. You're not really Christ-focused at that point. So when you're self-focused, it's hard to think your way out of the problem, even if you're intellectually aware that nothing's really happening to you. You can't think your way out of it. So
yeah,
but I think that what's important is to have a solid spiritual life in general.
Yes.
Because if you don't, you're not inclined to think first about your relationship with Christ. You're thinking first and foremost about yourself when it goes back to that fight or flight. It's me. I need self-preservation instead of being preserved in the hands of God. So that's, I think if your spiritual walk is not settled in following after a pattern where it's a part of your daily life, doing these spiritual disciplines, I think that's going to be much harder. So I think some of that, being able to do that, seems to be have a solid spiritual walk, have a solid plan of practicing spiritual disciplines, so that your mind goes to Christ first instead of to yourself first. Is that would be preventative in a sense, wouldn't it?
What you're doing is in addition to breathing and slowing down your brain processing so you can connect with truth. You've seen people who learned to swim, and they got in the water and they were swimming, but then they got out of the water, they were standing on the side of the pool, and somebody surprised them and knocked them into the water, and all of a sudden, what do? They panic. They can't think, okay, lay on my abdominal, bring my hands forward, kick. They panic. And that's what can happen to us. So you want to be proactive in taking care of yourself with slowing down the brain, and then you want to be filling your heart and your life with that which is reliable, which is truth. I'll give you a scripture to support what you've been talking about. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talked about two guys. They both built houses. Apparently, the houses were pretty much the same house. The big difference, as you and I know, one was built on rock and one was on sand. And so when the storms came, the one built on sand didn't endure. Every one of us are in three stages, either one of three stages in life. Either we're in the midst of a trial or adversity, we're coming out of it, or we're preparing to go into another. How I will handle today, the stressors, the uncertainties, all of the things that are going on are determined by my being proactive to take care of myself, in terms of the spiritual component. So I'm building my house on the rock. Jesus made it pretty clear the storms are going to come. Things are going to happen. And the guy that was ready for the storm did what? He built on a solid foundation. And that's what how I'm preparing now determines probably how I will endure the next trial or adversity I face. And again, that's a great sermon if somebody wants to develop it into one. I never have. But, the thing is that you have to remember you're preparing for what's coming in life. And so breathing, and you can do this, the breathing thing I was talking about, you can do that. You might if somebody's really battling anxiety, they might just do that every hour on the hour, do that in 5 times until they kind of get accustomed. And eventually what happens, you can actually just start breathing and thinking about the Lord, and things will slow down because you're conditioning yourself, to do that. Now, let me insert one thing very quickly here to protect everybody. There are some people who have extraordinarily elevated anxiety at certain points. And so they probably need some additional help that would involve one-on-one interaction with a good, solid, Christ-believing counselor. And everyone can get overwhelmed at times. And I don't want anybody to feel guilt or shame. So if somebody's feeling overloaded, it can always be very beneficial to go and talk to somebody who can, as much as anything, listen to you. So I don't want anybody to think that what we're sharing today, it's always absolute, but preparation for life is critical.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I was going to say. As far as the breathing technique, is that something you would recommend to people, or even clients, so forth, people who deal with anxiety in general? Should they practice those kind of techniques when they're fine, so that they can?
Yes. As part of the proactive preparation, let's suppose somebody is struggling with sleep disorders, and we weren't going to talk about that.
Right.
But, what people need to do is develop a sleep hygiene. And with a sleep hygiene, what you're talking about is it's a certain time you start easing down your life. You realize what the stimulants are: excessive light, things like that. Don't watch things that trigger and stimulate. You may have to stop watching some news stories. You may have to not watch certain shows. But, you get into that. And when you lay down, breathe instead of focusing on the woes of the day. Prayer works great. And while you're praying, just breathe to slow down your body, slow down your mind. And breathing is a great sleep technique. I know that some people could misunderstand what I'm saying. I am not talking about some mysticism. I'm talking about a physiological thing to where when your brain realizes that you got the threat covered, it slows down. And that's all you're doing. You're slowing it down so that you can make yourself more aware of the presence of God and that He's got this covered. He's not surprised. The words that are never said in heaven are, well, we didn't see that coming. That is not a statement in heaven. And so it slows it down. And rather than listening to the false narratives, the false voices that God's not going to come through with you. You're going to be starving. You're going to be out here begging on the street, or your wife's going to leave you, or your husband, because you're not making it, all those false narratives that can take off. You're just slowing it down so that you can replace the false anxiety-producing narratives with truth, which is greater is He that is in me than he that is in the world. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. For I'm persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, or any of those things can separate me from the love of God. And so you're going to listen to false narratives that are triggering you, or the true narratives, which are assuring you. And, as you're breathing, you're slowing down yourself physically instead of reacting so much physically, and you're allowing your life to be controlled by the truth and the presence of Christ.
And the more preventative measures that you take and build up those disciplines, the easier it is to switch that on when the anxiety hits, correct?
Absolutely. And in addition to that, anxiety, I would be remiss if I didn't stress this. Anxiety can be the result of sin. Example, here's someone who's involved in a sinful pattern in their lives, whatever they're doing, and they're feeling anxiety because they sense they're not in right relationship with God. And maybe they're sensing that I don't feel as protected. Is God going to come through? There's no way God going to bless my life with me living with this sinful pattern. And so as a result of that, what we have to do is be honest about the sin and say, you know what, here's why I'm in this situation today, because I did or something I shouldn't have, or I didn't do something I should have. And, the Bible says if we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us. I think a lot of people I deal with, if there's anything that they seem to fall short on, is the sufficiency of the death of Christ.
Mm.
And, he died for our sins before we were ever thought of by anybody else. My greatest need, your greatest need, everybody's greatest need was taken care of. If he took care of that before anybody else even knew I was coming on the scene, how much more can I trust him today? And so maybe I need to go make something right with someone, but I definitely need to go before God, like David did when he committed the horrific thing of what he did with the adultery and the murder. He was in torment until he was confronted and he dealt with the sin. And then, he began to realize, whoa, God is there. And so sin can produce obvious anxiety, shame, and what I would call justifiable guilt, in the life of a believer. If I'm wrong, I need to sense that. I need to make it right. And I mentioned the physical side. I mentioned the spiritual side. I mentioned slowing down the brain. Another thing that's really, it seems to be generating a lot of anxiety today is isolation. And, we need to connect with safe people who share our values. There's a text in Paul's letter to the church at Corinth that says, be not unequally yoked. And we have a tendency to only apply that to marriage. As I understand it in my life, it's not only my marriage. And by the way, I've been married to Glenda. You've met her. We've been 46 years. And, but on the other side of it, I have to have friends that I connect to. And they have to be safe. And those connections are good for me. In fact, detachment can generate massive depression. And when we feel isolated, it's very, very, very unhealthy for us.
Yeah. So in COVID-19, of course, and with the social distancing and the lockdowns, certainly these sorts of issues with depression spike. And people who never really thought of themselves as suffering from depression could find themselves with it, right? So
they could.
So, you had brought up earlier that you're doing this sort of Zoom meeting, FaceTime, Skype, whatever, with your clients. I'm curious as to, this is what we have to do because of what's going on with the pandemic. It's not preferable. What is lost without the, if there's a screen barrier, if there's not, you're in the same room, or you're close to your loved ones, or you're visiting with family.
Mm-hmm.
What have we lost by not having that physical connection, and how do we cope with that so that, we don't feel so isolated and depressed or anxious for everything, really, because of what's going on?
Well, as a counselor, when I mention counselors, I'm referring to pastoral counselors. I'm referring to all people who are involved in effective counseling, whether they're licensed professional counselors, licensed social workers, whatever. All of us are trained to watch for cues. The simplest cue with anxiety would be someone is talking to me and they're telling me they're feeling very anxious and they're really fidgety, they're wiggling their hands and they're crossing their feet and they're squirming. Those are all signs of anxiety, that their brain's very active and the body is responding to that. And so if they're sitting like this, you don't know what's going on. And in that context, what you have to do is to say, tell me what's happening with you right now physically. Are you noticing any shortness? You have to ask. How's he going to find out?
Right.
Are you sensing any shortness of breath? Do you notice if you're twiddling your thumbs? Do you notice if you're having trouble sitting there calmly? You have, unfortunately, and see, before I didn't ask that because it made them more self-conscious. And if I'm working with someone one-on-one, I'm not going to ask them that a lot because I want those cues for me. They become they tell me kind of what's going on. The body keeps the score. And one of your biggest revealers of stress, anxiety, depression is your physical presentation. What's going on inside comes out, And so when you're talking with people, you're probably going to have to ask some more specific questions to be sure, as all the biblical counselors know, which I teach at Trinity, that we're gathering comprehensive accuracy. So you may have to ask, tell me what you're feeling internally. I think the second thing, and this is a danger that you have to watch out for as a therapist, you don't want to do too much of the work, okay? If I'm doing all the work and the other person is not doing any, we're not getting anywhere. They're becoming codependent on me. And when I'm detached from someone, the temptation is to really elevate. Can you see I care for you? Do you sense that? And you're just really talking 90 miles an hour and doing those sorts of things. So you have to maintain a calmness. And it's always helpful to have some good questions there just in case you need them. It's good to say, hey, listen, I think I caught what you said a moment ago, but that was so significant. Can you go through that again with me and let them know you're connecting with them, but don't make them dependent on you. So, that's one of the dangers of doing, even now, would it be better for the listeners if I could sit down with each one of them and we could talk about this and they could throw their specific questions at me? Sure. It'd be much more focused and probably more meaningful to them. So what you and I are doing is general, and that's kind of what you have to watch out that you're communicating to people true compassion. I try to pray before a session. Oh God, reveal yourself through me. I'm limited. I can't see their some of their body functions. I can't, tell what's going on. I even look at people's clothing. Like if somebody comes to see me and they're really, grunged up, not taking care of their personal hygiene, that's very telling,
Yeah.
And so but it's like I've known, I'm not going to confess for you, but I've been known, when we've taught live webinars and when I've recorded, I'll be sitting there in a shirt and tie and have on pajamas,
Right.
Nobody knows that, but, I've done that, or in shorts or something. So as counselors and people trying to be there, we have to find legitimate ways to build involvement, connectivity, but not do all the work. We have to present them. And as a biblical counselor, we can still insist on the homework. We can still insist on, we can still confront and do those things that are a necessary part of a healthy counseling relationship. The other thing I think we have to be aware of is ethical, and that is confidentiality. Like what you and I are doing today, Zoom is known to be vulnerable to hacking. I don't do any therapeutic intervention with Zoom. I do only telehealth because right now that seems to be the most reliable. And so I would suggest that, that people, be aware of the ethics of us maintaining confidentiality and protecting people. And even pastoral counselors are under that as well. One other thing, I would say this for people who are in pastoral roles, whether they're teaching pastors, and even now the churches that are meeting, the people can't hug, they can't shake hands, and all those sorts of things. I was talking to a friend the other day. Says we go to church, but we're all set, so many feet apart, and they've got the chairs arranged a certain way. And they said, I see people and I connect with them, but I can't shake hands with them, I can't hug them, and I miss that so much. And I think what people have to do is find ways to communicate. Handwritten notes to people for one another are really valuable. Calling somebody up and praying together on the phone is really, an intimate or connector kind of thing. I've got elderly parents right now that I can't go to because of the COVID thing, and I'm their caregiver, and so we're doing it by phone right now. And I would go if we had to, but I'm having to protect them right now because where I live, the COVID thing is off the map. We can't even go out here without wearing masks and maintaining social distance. We're fined if we're caught out in public without the mask on. So you have to watch for that, as well. But there are ways that we can connect and show, you may not be able to show the frontal hug or the side hug or the handshake, but what you want to do is look at other areas. So like voice interchanges, written notes are awesome, brief text, from a distance, I love you, or whatever we can do at that point. We have to be aware of those other avenues and be more dependent upon them right now. Nothing will fully compensate for the loss of the physical hug. There's a way that we're made to need that. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking, well, for so long, we've become a text-based culture where we send people text messages, we communicate on social media like Facebook and Twitter, where we talk to people, friends, family, through texting. And we didn't notice until that was all we could do, how much we took for granted face-to-face contact and
Yeah.
visiting families and stuff. And I think that for a lot of folks, I think there's a wake-up call here that, you whenever blows over, get off your phones and go see people,
In your electronic device.
right, and go have face-to-face conversations with people instead of with people you barely know that live 3 states away that you found on the internet. Because
Yeah.
I think that there is something true about that physical contact. And with my close friends, I'm a hugger. I'm not just a hugger for, acquaintances or whatever, but it's like, without your church family being able to do that, that really does take a toll on people who are otherwise think of themselves. Like, I tend to think of myself as rock solid. I'm the doctrine of immutability works for me too. I just, or impassibility, whatever. I'm just a solid rock. And that's actually not true. And as time goes on and you have less contact with people, less personal contact with people, it even takes its toll on me. And I don't even like people that much. So I imagine a lot of people are doing much worse than I
All
am.
your students just panicked over your grading.
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny.
But I
Well,
imagine,
I think again, and I would say homiletics is your field, not mine, but I would like to even insert just real quickly. I think for pastors who are doing online types of teaching with their people, I've known of pastors who are using Facebook, people are on YouTube, all kinds of things that they're doing to connect with their congregations. And one of the things I would encourage is you try to find ways that you're expressive toward them, and that you give people can read whether you love them or not. It may be a little fuzzy for a little while, but with time they can kind of tell who cares and who doesn't. But find ways, even in your preaching, to communicate compassion, not just emphasize the compassion of Christ, but the pastor's compassion for them as well. I was listening to a pastor, a month or so ago, a very large church, and he looked into the camera. It was on YouTube, and he told his people how much he loved them. He said, I'm just sick of not being able to see you. Man, he's not even my pastor. Somebody told me about him, and I listened. But it was really meaningful. And one other quick thing is pastors need to be careful here, all of us, that we don't minimize sin. It's, we need to help people to understand God hasn't changed. Sin is still very real. And the wages of sin are very, very real. So I would encourage, people who are preaching and teaching and reaching out, don't beat people up. Don't enjoy telling people they're going to hell or something. But we do need to be sure that we're still preaching the full counsel of God.
amen.
And so that's not in counseling per se. That's your world, homiletics. But I just wanted to put that in.
Well, homiletics is more Dr. Elliott's, where I teach one course in the preaching, but speaking of pastors, and you could even say deacons and Sunday school teachers and small group leaders and at the church, what are some practical things that they need to be doing right now to make sure the people in their charge, their flock or their small group or whatever, what should they be doing right now for their people and their fellow brothers and sisters from church?
Well, one simple thing, that's to keep the communication open from both ends. In other words, we're communicating to them our compassion for them, our understanding, our appreciation for them. Telling people that you value them and are thankful for them and their contributions is huge. I'm not into flattery or anything like that. Make sure it's true.
Yeah.
But, make sure that you're communicating to people that they matter to you. And as you do that, that opens up. See, a lot of people think, well, he's just calling me because he has to. or something. And so they go, well, I'm fine when they're not fine. But if they sense that you really care, and again, I don't want people to be codependent. I don't. The only person I'm okay with you being codependent on is the Lord. Okay, you can be totally dependent on Him and look to Him all the time. But you can still show people, look, I care for you. And with time, then that will allow them to say, well, I need to tell you, man, I lost my job. They shut down the business. We're not doing well. We're finding things in our marriage that we didn't know, were cracks in the foundation. And this is showing what the reality is, how we haven't been working on our spiritual lives, our relational lives, our parenting. And I'm overwhelmed. And see, people have to be able to share back without feeling like that the other person is going to use them to elevate themselves. If you said to me, Jim, I'm having financial difficulties now because, I lost my job. And I go, well, you know what? You should have been saving. Shame on you. Yeah. What have I done for you? And there may be some truth in that, but to say, hey, listen, who is your provider? Maybe you didn't do your best in the past, but today is the first day of the rest of your life. And I'll give credit to Total Cereal there for that statement. But to come back and to say, what do we do from here? And you have to have hope. And hope comes from knowing, I may not know the way out, but to know there is a way to deal with this.
Right.
And if people can work through pretty much anything if there's hope. If you lose hope, anxiety, depression, hopelessness consumes you so quickly. It's like there's an empty void there, and that hopelessness is looking for somewhere to go. And I personally think that the ultimate enemy, Satan, is there to kind of foster that a little bit. But whatever somebody believes, there has to be that hope. And so, maybe they are in a really desperate situation. And maybe what they need is to plug into some good, solid Christian stewardship person who can help them kind of arrange their finances and do some things like that. People need to have hope, and they need to have some sense that I will work through this. It's going to be tough, and I have to have perseverance and resilience to do it, but I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength.
Yeah, one of the things that I always think of when that happens, various churches that I've been a part of, when somebody loses their job, and that really does, and maybe they get unemployment, maybe they don't, depending on what kind of job you had and why you got laid off. And COVID-19, you get a stimulus check, but most of that went to that first month's rent, and you're trying to figure out the rest of it, So in that kind of situation, I've always been thinking that one way to give hope to people, just using this example, other examples of marriages falling apart, I'm not the guy to talk to. I'm the happiest married guy I know, except for maybe you, of course. But I do. There is.
Well, I know your bride. She's a wonderful lady.
She is. So I don't know, but with financial needs, I know that whenever churches pull together a little bit of money, bring some food, things like that, when people have real immediate needs, that may not give them all the hope that they're looking for, but it gives them enough to have hope. And so
Yep.
Practical things like giving when they're in need, in addition to the emotional and spiritual support, that's how you create hope when people are losing the hope. Because like you said, once they become hopeless, that takes an act of God to move them back. Because I have not been there personally, but I have seen it, and I have seen life spiral out of control where it ended, badly, as opposed to getting better. So I do think that you're right. They need to demonstrate genuine interest in the lives of their people, and be able to tell when I'm fine is not the truth. Because I say I'm fine. I'm good at telling everyone I'm fine, even if I'm not, because I don't want to get into it with anyone in particular. But if I don't get into it, I'm going to enter that spiral. So how do you tell when someone's not fine when they say they're fine? I think everyone wants to know the answer to that.
Well, one, on the hopeless thing, the way we're wired because of our fallen nature, we tend to gravitate toward the negative. In other words, if somebody comes into your business and they have a negative experience, they tell 13 people, is what the research seems to indicate. If they have a positive experience, they tell 3. And so people have a tendency to default toward the negative. And I think it's because of the fallen nature of man. And so what happens with hopelessness is it continues to spiral downward. And then ultimately, you know, there's usually a very negative, catastrophic ending to that. And so when somebody looks at you and says, I'm fine, you may have to, in that situation, say, okay, now I want you to promise me something. I'm going to believe you right now, but I want you to promise me that you trust that I care for you, and that when you need to talk, you'll touch base with me. Because sometimes when you ask somebody, they know something's out of line, but they haven't quite figured out what it is yet. And so they're in the discovery process. So when they look at you, they're not sure. Is this delayed grief that I'm experiencing? Is there some other sense of loss? Have I lost sight of the truth? They don't know themselves. They just know that the emotions are delivering messages of hopelessness and despair, but they don't know why. And you know, and so what you can do is keep the door open, and then jot down in your planner, I'm going to call him back in 3 days, or I'm going to send him a note this afternoon. Hey, listen, thanks for taking time to talk with me today. I always enjoy interacting with you. And handwritten notes are very, very, very powerful. I know everybody's down on the U.S. mail. I'm very aware of that. But I know when I get a handwritten note from somebody, oh, it's just so meaningful. And probably one of the biggest things I get back from people is just a note that says, hey, love you, praying for you, God's good, or, you know, something like that. And so that can be very powerful. But what you have to do, intentionality, what we have a tendency to do is, yeah, I'll pray for you. And then we go, okay, I'm going to pray, oh, God, help George, you know, and then we forget it because we have so many cares in our own lives. What I have to do is maintain a calendar structure that, you know, George shared with me a prayer concern. I need to follow up. And I write that in my future to-do list. I plan out I have to. And, you know, with Trinity, with the number of students we have, with the number of people that contact us for help and things like that, we have to be very intentional with our time because we're still grading a lot of dissertations and all that. So we have to be focused in how we do that. So I have to write down, I need to follow up. You and I have a mutual friend right now that's going through a really, you know, tough time.
Yes.
And, you know, we both try to reach out to him, and we'll both continue to reach out to him.
Right.
But we have to be intentional about that because you can get distracted. And I think a lot of times pastors get overwhelmed. And so what I would say is you can't keep that on your mind all the time. So write it down. Wednesday, I'm going to call and check on George. Just write it down. Pray for him, and then, you know, put him on your prayer list and move on and think about yourself, your family. And a lot of pastors are not really good at self-care. And I know that's not our big deal today. But pastors, if you burn out and you lose hope, you can't help anybody else. So being proactive and taking care of yourself is critical.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. We conclude on, because actually I wanted to ask you about that, or at least from a different angle. So I'm not a working pastor. I at my church I fill a pew. Okay, it's the one time I get to be judgmental towards my pastor when he preaches, because he's also a student here at Trinity. So, yeah, it's a lot of fun. But what can lay people in the church? What can church members do to check on their pastors and their associate pastors and Sunday school teachers? Because they have to care for so many. What are things that we can do? You say handwritten notes, it's like a lost art. And I agree with you that those seem effective, and you don't have to write Shakespeare. You can write
No, you do not.
You can write 3 sentences and put it in the mailbox. But
But
what should I be doing to make sure my pastor's okay, and that our small group leaders are okay?
And I should disclose, I'm just starting my 9th full year with Trinity, you know.
Yeah.
And so I have been doing this, and I work full time for Trinity, and I do enough counseling to maintain my license, you know. But I was a pastor, and I had been, you know, for a long time, and I served, you know, some churches that, you know, ran over 1,000 in Sunday school and stuff like that. And so I kind of speak less as a counselor and more, I guess, in a pastoral. I'm not currently, and I hadn't pastored in a while. But I think on the other side of the coin, I think one is the assurance that that the pastor is being prayed for. And don't just assume he knows that. Just drop him a note. Dear brother pastor, this morning in my prayer time, I remembered you and your family. And today I prayed that you'd know the love of Christ in a very specific way. Secondly, do nice things for him. I know people don't have a lot of money sometimes. But even if you send him a gift card to I know right now we can't eat out very effectively, but like little things like, maybe you get a deal on some movie passes of a good movie or something, and you send them to him. Or every once in a while, I had people through the years that had, vacation properties, and they let Glenda and I go and spend time there. Just tangible ways that you can express that. But let me take one of the biggest.
Yeah, a $5 Krispy Kreme donuts gift card to make them happy.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Whatever. Just anything. It's not the amount as much as there's a tangible gift here. He didn't just say bless me. He actually did bless me.
Right.
Now let me tell you one of the biggies. Today, the church is going through some interesting dynamics right now with everything that's going on. And it's not just the COVID thing. It has to do with the notion of absolute truth and all those kinds of things.
Right.
And, the church is under assault, and pastors are carrying, and a lot of people are carrying the weight. Okay. A lot of my fellow believers are just carrying the weight, and pastors feel that and everything. Pastors need to know that there are people who have their backs covered. At any given time, no pastor is ever totally popular with everybody.
Right.
And he needs to know there's some people there that have him covered. If somebody's out spreading slander, there's certain truth people who need to address that. And I remember years ago, I was serving a church, and we had a staff member that somebody didn't like what he did with the Sunday school. I don't even remember what it was. And the person that didn't like it started spreading a rumor that he was having a sexual affair with another woman in the church. And I took an attorney and the chairman of personnel, and we went and made a call. And we got that stopped right there.
Wow.
We did. We got it stopped right there. And I made it very clear to him, and I know some people would come back and say, well, you're not supposed to use the courts. Well, in that situation, I made sure this guy was a believer. Yeah. But that had to be stopped because this was an effective man of God. He loved the Lord so much. When I was around him, I almost felt like a pagan, and I was the pastor, and he was a staff member, and yet he was far more spiritually mature than I was. I mean, he'd been through the trials, and I was not going to watch my friend and my brother be slandered like that. I just wasn't going to tolerate it. I knew that other people might come back against me, but I just did that. And I tried to protect staff people, through the years. But on the other side of it, the pastor needs to know that there are people that have him covered. That if there's stuff out there, if I can borrow this from Barney Fife, they're nipping it in the bud. Yeah. And pastors need that today because the culture's out there. They're spreading rumors because all they have to do is just start. Well, I saw him down by the liquor store, or what I heard that he had been looking at something on his computer, or it is. Well, maybe he is looking at something. I'm hearing that from pastors.
Yeah.
And so people are trying to discredit them, and of course that's the discourse out there in the world today too. If you don't like somebody, destroy them. And I think for pastors to know that there are a group of people who love them, believe in them, and I'm not saying the church members condone improper conduct. Don't hear that, but They need to know that there's somebody there that they're standing with them, and when they preach some of the tough stuff or have to make hard decisions, and they know, when they make those decisions, there's going to be feedback on it. There's going to be. That they have some people that still love them, looking out for them, protecting them, defending them, and things like that. That is critical. And you and I both know when we did the live webinars, almost every class I did, there would be some point where somebody would share a prayer concern. I've been voted out of my church, or, I'm under assault right now. I'm being threatened. Would y'all pray for me? And, almost every class I taught, at some point that happened. Yeah. And so and you've seen it, we get calls and all kinds of things like that. So pastors need to know that there are people who love them and are standing with them now.
Amen. Well, all
Yeah.
right. This has been a very good conversation. I hope that it has been helpful for everybody else. Any final thoughts that you want to give to our audience?
I would say this on depression. When you feel down, there's legitimate depression, okay? If I'm feeling kind of sad, I need to ask myself the question, what have I lost? Or what's kind of out of line? Or maybe I'm believing something that's not true. And
Mm,
so depression is a messenger. And so, I believe there's legitimate depression. It might warn me there's something wrong with me physically. It might warn me there's something out of line in my spiritual life or whatever. So let it be the messenger, but do not allow it to be deterministic. Now, then, research seems to indicate that for some people, about up to 50%, I talked about this with anxiety, but about 50% of depression can be DNA, produced. It's kind of in the DNA, the genetics. Again, that does not have to be deterministic. You have to be proactive. And so what you're doing, remember the guy, he built his house on the rock. He was preparing for the inevitable storm. And all of us, I'll be confessional. That's something I have to watch for every once in a while is depression in my own life. So when that happens, I know, all right, stop. I don't beat myself up. I don't go guilt or shame myself. And then I figure out, okay, what's out of line here? And then find the truth. And maybe I do need to deal with something. Maybe there's something I need to make right with somebody, something I need to confess. Maybe I'm believing something false. If people have chronic depression, I would go see my doctor and make sure that you don't have something going on, that can cause harm, especially people going through deep grief, to have a little something to offset a little bit of that sadness and kind of get them over the hump just a little bit. Not everybody needs that. Not everybody does. But sometimes it can be helpful to certain people.
yeah.
But I think with depression, and again, we recognize things. I'm depressed. So what I want to do is to find out what's out of line. And it may be several things out of line. So then I want to remove whatever that is. But you always, always, always have to replace it with truth. And the truth is, greater is he that is in me. I mean, you read Paul's struggles. I was pressed on every side. I almost despaired even of life. Even Jesus agonizing in the garden, Father, if there's any other way, let this cup pass from me. But what's the common thread? Jesus looked to the Father and he trusted the ultimate plan and purpose of God. What did Paul do? Man, it got to him every once in a while. You can see when he's venting that out. But ultimately he was victorious. Why? Because he looked to the Lord and he trusted the Lord. And we can find tons of people in the Bible that battled. I mean, you look at what was Elijah that had the great victory on Mount Carmel. Right. Man, he's having the great revival and everything. And a few days later, he's sitting out in the desert ready to commit suicide. Pastors go through that. Man, they have a mountaintop and boom, all of a sudden they're thinking, I should be dead. I should give up the church. You gotta sometimes pull back and rest and listen to the heartbeat of God.
Yeah, and Paul, definitely. And Paul is a good example. If Paul could bear it all in a letter that's going to be read in front of a church, yeah. And for centuries now, you can open up about your own issues to somebody. But if you're feeling that, I like what you said about depression is a messenger, which carrying a
so is anxiety too.
Yeah, that these are messengers carrying a message about something else. The depression is not the thing. The anxiety is not the thing. It's telling you about a thing. And so working that out, even in your own life and with somebody else, whether it's your pastor or a counselor or whoever, that's vital. You shouldn't let that, you should pay attention to the messenger. Don't ignore the messenger, right? Because it just gets worse if you do. So yeah, that
you give in to the messenger and he keeps talking louder and louder. And there you are. All you're getting is one message. It's hopeless. You're doomed. And there are people, that's their thought pattern.
Yeah.
And you have to recognize it, remove it, and replace it. And listen, God said in Ezekiel, I'll give you a new heart and a new mind. And that's a prayer for me ongoing. God, help me to have the heart and mind that honors you no matter what else comes.
Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. Depression and anxiety are messengers. And then I learned another phrase today I'd never heard before in my life, and that's
what's that?
Sleep hygiene. I've never heard that. I wonder.
Hey, you and I might come back and do one of those.
There we go. Well, definitely you've got to come back. So you were a big hit last time you talked to me. So I always like to have you on because people get sick of hearing what I have to say, and people
Oh,
really,
no, they don't.
well, they really do, and they really enjoyed what you had to say last time. So I'm glad to have you on. Need to have you on more regularly than this. So I'm looking forward to it, and I'll let you pick the topic next time, and I will.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, and I'll put the burden on you to carry it. But I do thank you for being here. Is there you don't have any social media accounts, do you?
Well, I'm not allowed to, so I don't do Facebook or
Oh,
any of
okay.
those things. Yeah, if
So
somebody wants to communicate through Trinity is the way. jchatham at trinitysim.edu.
right. So they
And,
can't follow. Yeah, they can't follow him on Twitter.
I don't do any of that.
It,
Yeah,
yeah. If you,
it's legal reasons.
oh,
Uh,
sure.
it is, and I don't have a Facebook page. I don't really want one. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be ugly, but it's just not to my advantage because I could say something and then somebody use it against me later.
Right.
And
So
so
so if you So if you want more Dr. Jim Chatham, you need to audit his courses at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary for 35
that
days.
is the best way to do it.
And or if you can learn formally by becoming a student at our seminary, we'd love to have you. Dr.
Amen.
Chatham, thank you for being here. I appreciate it so much. You have a good one.
Thank you, Dr. Pritchett. God's mercies on all of our listeners.
Amen.